This is coming from the New York Times opinion column, and this was coming from Brent Staples. I've been holding on to this for a minute, but I really want to get this into the record. Shout out to T. Hassan Johnson for putting this up on his Twitter. I like getting historical pieces accurately because it's always a blueprint. And there's a saying that says, the past is never dead and buried. In fact, it's never even past. How the suffrage movement betrayed black women. The suffragist heroes Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony seized control of the feminist narrative of the 19th century. Their influential history of the movement still governs popular understanding of the struggle for women's rights and will no doubt serve as a touchstone for commemorations that will unfold across the United States around the centennial of the 19th Amendment in 2020. That narrative in the 6-volume history of the women's suffrage betrays more than a hint of vanity when it credits the Stanton-Anthony cohort with starting a movement that actually had diverse origins and many mothers. Its worst offenses may be that it rendered nearly invisible the black women who labored in the suffragist vineyard and that looked away from the racism that tightened its grip on the fight for the women's vote in the years after the Civil War. Historians are not inclined to hero worship, including Elsa Barkley Brown, Laurie Ginsburg, and Rosalind Turbrick Penn, have recently provided an unsparing portrait of the once neglected period. Stripped of her halo, Stanton, the campaign's principal philosopher, is exposed as a classic liberal racist. There's a lot of those who embrace fairness in the abstract while publicly enunciating bigoted views of African American men, whom she characterized as Sambos and incipient rapists in the period just after the war. The suffrage struggle itself took on a similar flavor, acquiescing to white supremacy and selling out the interests of African American women when it became politically expedient to do so. This betrayal of trust opened a rift between black and white feminists that persists to this day. This toxic legacy looms especially large as cities, including New York, prepare monuments and educational programs to celebrate the centennial of the 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, which barred the states from denying voting rights based on gender. Black feminists in particular are eager to see if these remembrances own up to the real history of the fight for the vote, and whether black suffragists appear in them. The famous suffrage convention convened in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848 featured Stanton and her partner in arms, Lucretia Mott, in addition to the towering figure of Frederick Douglass, the abolitionist and dyed-in-the-wool supporter of women's rights who was on his way to becoming one of the most famous speakers of the century. Were it not for Douglass's oratory, the historian Lisa Tetrault tells us, in the Myth of Seneca Falls, the controversial resolution demanding the vote for women might have actually failed. It became clear after the Civil War that black and white women had different views of why the right to vote was essential. White women were seeking the vote as a symbol of parity with their husbands and their brothers. Black women, most of whom lived in the South, were seeking the ballot for themselves and their men as means of empowering black communities besieged by the reign of racial terror that erupted after emancipation. The tension escalated in the run-up to the 15th Amendment, a provision that ostensibly barred the states from denying Negro men the right to vote. Reasonable people could, of course, disagree on the merits of who should be given the vote, women or black men. Stanton instead embarked on a Klan-like tirade against the amendment. She warned that white women would be degraded if Negro men preceded them into the franchise. Admiring historians have dismissed this as an unfortunate interlude in an exemplary life. By contrast, historian Laurie Ginsburg argues persuasively that racism and elitism were enduring features of the great suffragist makeup and philosophy. Similarly, the historian Faye Dunn wrote that Stanton dipped her pen into a tincture of white racism and sketched a reference to a nightmarish figure, the Black Rapist, and lashed out from the pages of suffragist paper that she and Anthony published. Her message, the passage of the 15th Amendment, would mean only degradation for women at the hands of Negro men. Must have cheered the Ku Klux Klan as it terrorized the Black South. Douglass was clearly wounded by what he described as the employment of certain names such as Sambo and the Gardener and the Bootblack and the rest, but gracefully declined to answer insult with insult. Instead, he summarized in a dramatic fashion the differences between the interests of black and white suffragists and the case for federal protection of black voters. When white women, because they are women, he said, are hunted down through the cities of New York and New Orleans, when they are dragged from their houses, hung upon lampposts, when their children are torn from their arms and their brains dashed upon the pavement, when they are objects of insult and outrage at every turn, when they are in danger of having their homes burnt down over their heads, when their children are not allowed to enter schools, then they will have the urgency to obtain the ballot equal to our own. Douglass cut to the central fallacy of the white suffragist push, that African American women could magically separate their blackness from their femaleness. The 15th Amendment was, of course, ratified. Women would wait another 15 years for the 19th. Racism intensified among suffragists as they neared their goals. African American luminaries like the noted anti-lynching crusader Ida B. Wells and the civil rights leader Mary Church Terrell became more deeply and publicly engaged. As in other instances, suffragists outside the South used the racism in the Jim Crow states as an excuse for their discriminatory treatment of their black suffragist sisters. Black women's suffrage clubs that sought formal affiliation with the national white suffrage movement were discouraged from doing so on the grounds that admitting them might anger white Southerners. It has since become clear that this was a ruse Northern whites used to obscure their own discriminatory practices. The most blatant example of accommodationism came in 1913 when organizers of a huge suffragist parade in Washington demanded that black participants march in an all-black assembly at the back of the parade instead of with their state delegations. Wells famously refused. Terrell, who marched in a colored delegation as requested, believed at the time that white suffragists would exclude black women from the 19th Amendment, nicknamed the Anthony Amendment, if they thought they could get away with it. These episodes fueled with African American community a lasting suspicion of white suffragists and the very idea of political cooperation across racial lines. Historians are rightly warning groups involved in suffrage commemorations not to overstate the significance of the 19th Amendment. It covered the needs of middle-class white women quite nicely, but it meant very little to black women in the South, where most lived at the time and where election officials were well practiced in the art of obstructing black access to the ballot box. As African American women streamed in to register, Southern officials merely stepped up the level of fraud and intimidation. By this time, the former suffragists of the North were celebrating the amendment and were uninterested in fighting discrimination against women who were suffering racial as opposed to gender discrimination. As the historian Rosalind Terborg Penn writes, within a few years, white supremacy was vicious throughout the South. Unlike black men who had been disenfranchised within 20 years after the ratification of the 15th Amendment, black women had lost the vote in less than a decade. It would take another half century and a new suffrage campaign with black women in a leading role before that black community was fully enfranchised through the Voting Rights Act of 1965. A recent uproar over the monuments to white supremacy that dominate public spaces in the South has put civic groups on notice that memorials often convey pernicious messages and perpetuate historical wrongs. Organizers need to keep that in mind as they commemorate a movement in which racism clearly played a central role. And that was from Brent Staples, July 28th, 2018, New York Times. This doesn't surprise me. This does not surprise me. What does shock me is that going all the way back from the suffrage movement in the 1840s, while we were still enslaved, black women keep siding and helping white women in their causes. And every time white women get what they want, they toss them aside. And black women keep falling for this. That's like I'm going to put out the myth of white womanhood. I know Brent Staples is kind of soft shoeing this, because if you just think about it and listen to what he says in this particular opinion piece, in this article, this happened in the 1840s. It's happened in the 1860s. The racism happened in the 1860s when black men were going to get to the vote after they fought for it. Black men didn't get it just because they were men. They actually took arms and went out there in the Civil War and they fought for it. They earned the right to get their enfranchisement. They earned the right to get their vote. As much as I love black women, they didn't do it. White women especially didn't do it. The thing is, they wanted parity with their white man, and it was a disgrace and a slap in the face for a black man who earned his stripes to get something that they couldn't get. Happened again in the 1920s, as described in this article. The exact same thing, because those white women did not help you when you got the vote. The black women got the vote in 1920, didn't come down and help you and get your vote and keep your vote once you got it, did they? They turned their pretty little heads and their snooty little selves and cozied up to their white man, to their white brothers and their white husbands, and agreed with them when they took your vote away, because they didn't think you should have had it in the first place. You didn't get it till 1965. Now, did those white suffragists come down in 1965 and help you? No, they waited till after you got it. And then the feminism came in and decided to band with you because your man was going to get something that they wanted, which is access to jobs, access to good, decent jobs in the workforce, and to an education that had been denied them. And then again, what did the feminists do? They wanted what was rightfully fought for by your man. Your men fought and died for that shit. They went to war for it in World War I and World War II. They went to war for it in Korea. They went to war for it in fucking Vietnam and shed blood in the fucking gulags of Vietnam. They earned that shit. They rioted, they marched, they stomped, they were hung, they were bitten by dogs, chased by cops, all that stuff. Formed organizations, they fought for that stuff. And what did white women do? Okay, thank you very much. You black sisters, guess what? We're oppressed too. You and us are oppressed too. And guess who's oppressing your man? Your rapists, no good Sambos, as the feminists would put. In fact, they didn't call you Sambos anymore because that was offensive. And what did they do? They had themselves put on the docket as an oppressed group, and they got civil rights. And guess who got the bulk of the fruits of the civil rights? It wasn't your man that fought for them. It was your white sisters in arms. And again, you would think that black women would learn and stop falling for this feminist trap. You would think that the feminists themselves, that have to read the books and know the history, would stop siding with white women over your man. And some of the stuff that comes out of women's mouths are worse, actually a lot worse than what the white women are saying about them. So all the stuff that was supposed to go to you, supposed to go to your community, supposed to go to your family, guess what they do? The white women, why do you think the wealth gap is so big? Especially after the 1940s. Why do you think the wealth gap is so big and continues to grow? That's the one thing that wasn't talked about. That is the one thing, I appreciate my black economists. I appreciate them to death. But there's one thing that they did not say since the 1940s. That the jobs that were supposed to go to the men, half of the group, half of the black group went to white women. Especially after the 1960s. You got to look at a chart and you can see black women got nothing, virtually nothing as a group. People that got something were white women. The whole law, the whole civil rights movement was supposed to bring black men into parity with white men first. Not only did it not bring black men into parity with white men, it actually started to reverse it. In fact, actually did was bring white women closer to parity in white men. So now that white women out earn black men too, as a group, and push your black men down towards you. In fact, what it did was push the white women up closer to parity with their men, and made their household net worth bigger, and push your black man down towards you to actually make your net worth half of what the white household is. And if you look at the stats, guess what happens? You can actually see it. In every single class, the white household makes way more money than the black household. Why is that? All you did was take money out of your family and hand it over to white women. Not once, not twice, but 4 times. You took power out of your black man's hand and handed it to white women. Not once, not twice, but 4 times. And you're still doing it. You're getting ready to do it again. Because this Me Too stuff is actually going to do what? Take power out of your black man's hand and put it into white women's hand. Because it's all a power play. And you are going to buy into it too. Because all them athletes that are making millions of dollars, because you get mad, what are you going to do? You're going to call the police. You're going to call the cops. You're going to have that check. You're going to have that money taken out of that man's pockets because you're mad. You're going to have him fired. You're going to have him out of the league. You're going to have him working in the grocery store for $19 an hour instead of making $19 million a year. And then you go back and cry and say, black men aren't building. Black men aren't helping. Black men aren't doing anything. Then the bricks that it takes to build, you're actually doing what? You're giving it to your white counterpart, who's taking it instead of building her house, her man building her house with the bricks that he earned. You're giving them the bricks that's supposed to go to the black house and making their house bigger and more comfortable. And then you wonder how come the black man hasn't built anything for you. Anyway, this is just it wasn't really a short article. It was actually a pretty long opinion piece. But when I read it, man, I think I'm a little tired because I would actually go into a full rant. Most black women do not respect their men or their male counterparts. Not even their sons do they even respect. Because if they did, they would not let this go on. If they cared about themselves, and I think that's the biggest problem in this. Black women are projecting. Black women do not really respect themselves or really think that they're worth anything. And they project that out onto their men. In my opinion, there's no way that a self-respecting, fully developed woman would not want to see the fruit that she produces do well and do everything in her power to see that the fruit that she produces do well, just like any other group. This dysfunction is heavy, y'all. This black dysfunction is really, really heavy. Anyway, that's my piece and then my rant. So I'm going to shut it off here. This is BGS out, and I will see you guys on the next one.